from Washington, D.C., this is Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Hena Zuberi. Today, we're bringing the best reports and analysis of the week. Let's start with the best reports.
Love was present in London, Canada all week long. Thousands gathered in vigils, physical as well as virtual. Thousands marched, hand in hand, with love in their hearts to show solidarity with Muslims. Hundreds prayed together with tears in their eyes. This couple drove 100 kilometers to participate in the Afzal funeral.
In the last 3 years, Syrian Muslim refugee families have come to our town with children that we love and care for, and we value their friendship very much.
In Guelph, Mohammed El Doulaimi says a few hours after the attack, my non-Muslim neighbor knocked on my door with a box full of cookies and a card signed by the family members saying that you are not just our neighbors, but our friends. God bless you continually and give you peace. That love was transmitted live to the whole of Canada. The Ottawa Police Service report shows that hate crimes were up 57% in 2020. The London murders of a Muslim family raised the tide of hate to a higher level. Why would a man hate and kill a whole family whom he did not know before? Did he become a hate monster through online forums? Was it the negative media coverage of Muslims? Was it Canada not recognizing Islamophobia as a real problem? Was it government inaction after the Quebec mosque massacre? Researchers will research. Time will tell if this love really defeats the rise of hate. While wounds of London are still fresh, hate continues to raise its ugly head. In a Zoom vigil attended by thousands of neighbors of all faiths, some hate mongers Zoom bombed it. Fawzia Mazhar, the executive director of the Women's Coalition and the organizer, led all in the vigil to calmly handle the hater. Politicians of all parties were around, showing sympathy and desire to take action. But the Prime Minister himself sounded a bit skeptical when he said, "Do we need more proof that Islamophobia exists?" Muslims are skeptical as well. Muslim women were crying in the online vigil, wondering if their hijab would make them a target. People are afraid of going out. This Muslim woman actually wants to hold politicians responsible. She says all of this talk was done after the Quebec massacre, but no systemic change had addressed the problem.
Is this how we're going to be living our lives, just secluded in between our walls? And this is unacceptable. Leaders of this country have to step in now. It's high time to, take action now, immediately.
Muslims fast during Ramadan, and then they offer prayers on Eid Day and celebrate. But not in China, and definitely not Muslims in eastern Turkestan, which the Chinese call Xinjiang or New Colony. Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims are not allowed to fast nor pray. The police actually go around before dawn, raiding houses if the lights are on. The light indicates that someone is up early eating before fasting. However, This Eid, the Chinese Communist Party decided to fake the Eid. Yes, they created a fake Eid. Here is a clip broadcasted by Chinese state TV. Take a look before we break it down for you. The first thing to note is that this Chinese TV did not show any Eid prayers, because prayers are not allowed. That is consistent with the Communist China's policies. Second, notice the musicians, which are placed at the top of the mosque. As a matter of fact, it is against the Muslim culture to have musicians at the top of a mosque. It is also against the concept of respect among Turkic Muslims, but the Chinese producer probably has not studied Islam deep enough. Here is an earlier video of the mosque. In this 6-year-old clip, you can see a welcoming plaque with a statement of faith in Islam. It was still there 4 years ago in this CCTV video, and there was no Chinese flag. Even in September 2017, the multicolored scriptural plaque was there, but then the Chinese flag was added. It shows how gradually the character of a mosque was destroyed. 2 years ago in 2019, however, that faith-based plaque which adorned its main entrance was gone. A Chinese flag is also installed at the top of the mosque. There is hardly any mosque in any Muslim nation which installs a national flag at the top of the mosque. This is simply not done. But in China, those mosques which still exist are forced to install a flag, and in some mosques, a photo of the Chinese president is installed where God's name is written on the mihrab. Kashgar is an ancient Muslim city and an icon for the Islamic civilization. The Chinese Communist Party has erased the historic Islamic identity. This Eid-Gah mosque was in the center of a bustling heart of the Kashgar. The Chinese demolished houses to create this plaza for tourists. The BBC estimates that 16,000 mosques are demolished in East Turkestan. Thanks to tourists, this mosque still survives. A former imam of this mosque was arrested in 2017 and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The current imam at the mosque, however, denies religious oppression by the ruling Communist Party. The mosque structure dates back to 996 AD. It has a capacity for 20,000 people to pray, but Muslims are no longer allowed to pray here. Here is Aiden Anwar from US-based Save Uyghur campaign. Her family from Kashgar is missing 93 relatives.
I'm an Uyghur Muslim, and right now I have 93 relatives in East Turkestan, also known as Xinjiang, who we deem as missing, meaning we've had no contact with them for the past 3 years. We don't know how many are in these re-education camps and whether they are alive or dead.
Kashgar is almost empty nowadays. Most of its people are in the largest concentration camp since the Nazis. They cannot even practice their faith, except when the Chinese government forces them to dance. Dancing for the party and no prayers for Allah. Americans speak Arabic when they say sugar, coffee, sherbet, and gypsum, or when they say mattress, sofa, cotton, and talcum. The streets Americans pave and the houses Americans furnish were created by Muslims. Rose Wilder Lane, in her book, The Discovery of Freedom, has a long list of things that came from Muslims to America. She included beds, bed linens, and tables as Muslim inventions. She also attributes strawberries and ice cream to Muslims as well. If you wonder how these things came to America and who brought them here, her answer is the Crusaders. Yes, the Crusaders. The Crusaders were wild European Christians of the Middle Ages. They slaughtered Muslims in the Holy Lands. However, they eventually learned a bit from Muslims as well. And when they returned home in Europe, they brought back with them some luxuries of life. When these Europeans came to what they thought was the New World, they brought a bit of that culture with them.
Thanks for watching our report. Let's take a quick break, and after the break, we'll share the best analysis segments of the week.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Thank you so much. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Irfan Chaudry, who is the Director of the Office of Human Rights, Diversity, and Equity. Irfan, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you.
Our pleasure. Now, the province of Ontario has just recently granted around $300,000 to a couple of Muslim organizations just for the purpose of fighting Islamophobia in schools. Now, when it comes to increased tolerance and understanding, how important are such diversity programs within educational institutes in your professional opinion? And will this make a difference?
No, it's a good question. I think the funding is important, but I always have that with a caveat if it has to be sustainable and it has to be consistent. And so often what you see with these types of funding programs, there might be on 1 to 3 year cycles, and that's where it really has the gap in a broader impact, I would say, because often these programs, educational related, awareness related, they get, funding at the beginning. And then when things really amp up in terms of awareness and people being able to connect to these types of funding and educational opportunities, funding is now not available and these projects just disappear. So I think the funding is always a good start, but it needs to be sustainable. It needs to be long-term.
Now, with a string of recent Islamophobic attacks across the country, which we can trace back to the 2017 Quebec City mosque shooting, as well as the Muslim man in Toronto that was shot outside of a mosque just last year, do you believe that Islamophobia is a real issue in Canada and Ontario?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers, as we're kind of being more aware of them, are unfortunately speaking for themselves. Even before the Quebec mosque shooting, there was a number of, smaller related, incidents in and around Muslim communities across Canada. But now we're seeing more visibility in terms of the levels and layers of violence, right? And the unfortunate, crime that happened in London a few weeks back. To me, that would have been a tipping point. Quebec Mosque, actually, for me, would have been a tipping point around just the impact of Islamophobia in Canada. But then what we saw with London, it kind of highlights it's still a key consideration. And what's really unfortunate is how it still continues even after such a horrific event that we saw a few weeks back. Because people, in Edmonton, for example, 2 Muslim women last week were attacked at knife point wearing the hijab in a public space. And so these things still continue. And I think there needs to be more of a elevated discourse and awareness of just the impact of how people might have misconceptions about the community that go unchallenged. Well, now we're seeing them being amplified in negative ways in offline spaces.
Now, where do you believe that this anti-Muslim violence and sentiment in Canada is emanating from?
In some of the work I've done on researching, hateful content on social media platforms, that's the easy starting point, especially how we've been, engaging online for the last year and a bit because of COVID. A lot of our lives have shifted, almost 100% online in terms of social interactions. But I think what becomes more problematic is it's not the overt, sentiment that's impactful, because most social media platforms now are able to kind of take away or remove some of the overtly hateful content. It's the subtle stuff, right? It's the things where people say, well, don't come to our country, we can't adapt, different tropes like that. Even though many Muslims in Canada have been here for generations and generations, you still have this very strong dynamic of othering the Muslim community in Canada. And it's really amplified on social media through the sharing of memes, through the sharing of misinformation, through the sharing of, uneducated assumptions related to the community and a fear of Sharia law coming into Canada. And I think all these types of misinformed frames of references are able to really scare individuals that don't have an awareness or a broader scope of the world, and feeds into their ignorance, if we be quite bold. And then we're seeing some acting out in very violent, negative ways. And so I think there's been an amplification of the anti-Muslim narrative online, just in the context of COVID, but also in the context of what we're seeing in Canada. No racialized group has been left untouched in terms of discrimination in a COVID era, right? If you just look at it the last year and a bit, almost every racialized group has been impacted in a negative way because of stereotypes, because of violence, because of discrimination. And I don't know, and they're still early on in obviously our understanding of the COVID impact on these social interactions, but it's something really to be mindful of, that, it's being something like racial violence has been impacting all communities in Canada. And that's something really, really to pay attention to.
A lot of talk recently on countering the hate through legislation, and community-level organizations of all kinds and sizes are planning things like roundtables and summits to help inform the government of such human rights recommendations from their end. However, do you believe that this will play a role in shaping anti-Islamophobia legislation, keeping in mind the perceived failures of Bill 21?
I'll be optimistic on this, but I'm also hesitant in the sense of, even a couple years back when M103 was being put forward, and the only thing it was asking was for, members of parliament to condemn Islamophobia. And still there was a lot of resistance to that in terms of just even condemning it because of people feeling it was, playing identity politics. And so I think, we'll see how we are now, fast forward from the Quebec Mosque shooting, fast forward from the attack in London, Ontario. I'm really interested to see how this, national summit comes together and what real meaningful change will come. But I'm not sure, because all these things always depend on political cycles, right? So in the event there's a federal election happening, how might that impact any traction the summit has? In our province, both major cities, Edmonton and Calgary, will be going through municipal elections in October. And so seeing a lot of political candidates at the municipal level even highlighting platforms to address hate at the local level. But again, until we see the action, it's always going to just be words. And so I think that's where I'm hopeful we see more concentrated efforts, but it's more, proof is in the pudding in terms of how we understand this.
A lot of people are looking at the rhetoric of certain political leaders in Canada and how they have just spoken about Muslim rights over the years and how that might have contributed to this general Islamophobic sentiment or atmosphere that's been culminating until now. Do you believe that Canadian leaders have a responsibility to practice what they preach in order to increase understanding and tolerance in society?
100%, right? I think when you look at it, even in 2015, when the Conservative Party put together that barbaric cultural practices hotline, that single-handedly, put Muslim Canadians on the spot in terms of being perceived as a barbaric culture, that has long-term ramifications, right? You'll still see some of those information pamphlets and posters circulating online that really, again, fuel this fire. And so if some of these political leaders have had a growth experience and are learning that their position or their stance or their statements in previous years has really been negative and has impacted the community in a very, very harmful way, yes, acknowledgement is step one, but step two is, what are you going to do about it? Because right now what I'm observing is a lot of people in these positions of power have no idea what to do. And I think that's really concerning, because you have a lot of people in the community across Canada looking at political leaders to see what will you do. And there's a big question mark in terms of what can be done. And I don't know if anyone has the appetite to really go down a path that this needs to go down in terms of looking at our hate crime legislation, challenging some of the freedom of expression pieces that people are able to get, away with some of this hateful content. And so I think these are the conversations we need to start to open up, and not saying we want to take away, our rights and freedoms that all of us have, but I think we need to take a second look, because if our laws right now and legislation right now are incredibly weak to help us deal with some of these nuances that aren't overtly connected to hate crime, criminal code categories, we need more. And I think that's what I'm not seeing in terms of the appetite for people to have this type of dialogue.
We wanted to be advantageous of your presence today and ask you, when it comes to recommendations, what do you think that the federal government needs to do to help curb anti-Muslim hatred and violence in Canada?
Yeah, I think one starting point, again, I always know how long it takes to change legislation, but our hate crime legislation has not been looked at in this country since the 1990s. And so I think there's time to just, look under the hood, look at the language, look if there's any additions. In 1990, there was a section that was added under sentencing principles to consider hate and bias as a motive. And that's broad and applicable, but we also don't have some language around some of those nuances. And I think when we put that lack of direction in our legislation and leave it to the discretion of individual police services to administer that, it becomes very inconsistent, because one officer might deal with something in a completely opposite way than another officer, still the same type of file, let's say, but because that discretion is there for them to adapt how they choose, that's where you have inconsistency. So that'd be number one. Number two, we need more formalized hate crime training for law enforcement across Canada. Right now, it's done very inconsistently. Right now, most hate crime units tend to be under-resourced. And so I would argue, in addition to training, resourcing more of these units so we have that better capacity from an enforcement perspective, while at the same time trying to build capacity at the systemic perspective. And that's the one that's going to take a lot of time to address.
Some great insight there. We're here with Irfan Chaudry, who is Director of the Office of Human Rights, Diversity, and Equity. Thank you so much, Irfan, for your valuable time today.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Back to Hena Zuberi in the news studio.
Thank you, Hena Zuberi. I have the wonderful opportunity today to talk about the very recent Iranian elections, and the newly elected president, under a lot of controversy, is Ibrahim Raisi. And to talk a little bit about his understandings of foreign policy, but also to talk about what's going on in Iran. My guest today is Yousof Azizi, and Yousof is a PhD student in public administration at Virginia Tech in Alexandria, Virginia. Arlington's stuck in my mind. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So let's first talk about Iran and where it is today to put this new election in some kind of perspective. I know that there was a lot of uproar over the now former president, and then a lot of controversy with the newly elected president. So before we get to this presidential stuff, let's talk about public affairs in Iran.
Okay, yeah, so Iran is like United States. The political system includes three branches of government, the executive branch, the parliament, and the judiciary. So they have, since 1979, the Islamic Revolution in 1979, they have a kind of hybrid regime. It is not all democratically elected politicians come out. Some of them are coming to the power, to the officials by selection. So it is a hybrid regime. We cannot put it as a really dictatorship or theatrical regime. We cannot put it as a democratic regime like the Western countries, if we assume they are democrat. It is a little, yeah, it is a little bit, has a background, a complicated background about the, the Iranian, about more than 100 years. They are struggling for freedom, for justice, for all of the values that we respect in Islam too, but also we know that the humanities also respect that.
But how did these mullahs and everybody, I know that the government is split into two, and you have a religious side and a kind of a political side, which somehow the other cohere. But why are the people struggling? What are they struggling for?
So there are different people. The country has more than 80 million people, and each of them has different idea. There are Islamic beliefs there are secular people there are nationalist people there. So there are a lot of factors that participated in every people's mind to decide about the issues. But one of the most important challenges that Iran has, many countries has, even United States, even Western countries, and we can see in the pandemic, it is about the trust in government. And the trust in government now not in a good shape in Iran. Okay, it is due to bad decision making, it's bad policy making by the previous administration. I mean, the current administration, the Rouhani administration, or even it is because of fundamental issues like the structural, political structure of the constitution. That the constitution can be revised. This is the expectation that many people now asked for that. So I mean that the social movement and the needs that people require for better government, better governance, is something that's now apparent for everyone in Iran. And the question is that the elite and the parties and the officials would like to step, forward for that revision and reform in this section.
So who is this new president? And is he different from the old one? Is he going to bring reform? What's he going to do?
If we divide the foreign policy and domestic policy, this is just a hope. And we hope that because, the new president, Ibrahim Raisi, he has worked for over 40 years since the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran in the judiciary system against the corruption, against all of these law and regulation, to confirm that. And one of his slogans during the campaign about the corruption in executive branch, he believed that, okay, we did our job in judiciary, but it's not enough. We have to protect the civil rights. We have to protect the budgetary from the deficit from the executive branch, because of what happened as a corruption in Iran. Some people said that it is systematic corruption. Some believe no, it is not systematic. It's just some bad apples in the system. But he believes, and many people trusted him, that he could have some changes in this regard about the corruption in the executive branch, in the signing agreement and all of these issues we have in the United States, maybe in the past more, but now less. So this is one of the hope. But let's see if he is not willing to change some of the fundamental issues, as I mentioned before, in the political spectrum, in the political environment. So he would fail in the next 4 years, and people also would lose their hope in him. But you know, near 18 million people voted for him. So this is one of the most important challenges he has in the next administration.
Well, we know that the U.S. has led the way toward putting sanctions on Iran, and that has curbed the people's access to vital kind of substances. I have to admit, I don't understand putting sanctions on a country. We have nuclear weapons. The Western country have nuclear weapons. India, China, but we're determined that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. But the other thing is that recently Mossad snuck into Iran and stole some stuff. I am anxious to hear about that.
So yeah, on foreign policy, you know, Iran has been under sanctions since the revolution because, you know, it is. But the toughest sanction on Iran happened during the last the Obama administration, and then continued during the Trump administration. So the sanction is not something that Iranian strangers that they know how they can cope against that. So over that, but the fact is that Iran doesn't have any nuclear bomb. And the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, was signed that the Western countries and the United Nations Security Council, all of them has enough inspection and you know, oversight on Iranian activities in nuclear issues, that they make sure even if anytime Iran want to diverge its program, its civil program to nuclear bomb or atomic bomb, so they know it beforehand, about 1 year before that's happened, so they can do something in the international organization or international vote. So I mean that this is one of the main argument that President Obama and President Biden right now have about the restoring JCPOA, because when JCPOA is restored, the Iran nuclear program would be in the box that everyone can see and oversight and have a scrutiny over that, so they know what's happening there. And this is the only case within the struggle that Iran has with the West, especially the United States, that also the China and Russia agree on that okay, we don't want Iran access to the nuclear bomb. We want to have some kind of words on that. And Iran also too. Iran says that, okay, we are not looking for the bomb. We are looking for just using it as an energy, as the, you know, medical issues. So it is very good to cooperate to each other about this issue.
Well, then why did Israel send Mossad to go tipping around in Iranian territory?
So an Israeli issue, as you mentioned, many countries has a nuclear bomb. Israel has nuclear bomb too, and they are not under any kind of investigation by the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency. So they wanted to, you know, the Netanyahu, he wanted to say that, okay, Iranians say lie when they sign the JCPOA. They are still looking for something bad. They are still have some secret program. But as a matter of fact, we know
that's the same thing. I mean, Iran is not, if the Iranians are lying, so are the Israelis and everybody else out there.
Yeah. So I wanted to say that, yeah, the file that he claimed that he stole from Iran, as the intelligence service in the United States says, it is before 2003. And the intelligence services in the United States, they confirmed several times that even if Iran has any kind of military nuclear program before 2003, after 2003, Iran diminished any kind of secret program. And all of the program Iran has from the beginning, from uranium enrichment to the centrifuge, to all advanced centrifuge, everything now under the investigation by the IAEA. Everything in the country are investigated in the country. And no countries in the world has this kind of investigation on the country.
Exactly. I mean, So what does this new president think about all of this, from the sanctions to, do you think he's going to agree to talk with Biden to get a new deal to lift some of these sanctions? What's going to happen? I mean, or at least what does this new president promise he's going to do?
Yeah, before I answer your question, let me just mention two basic issues. First of all, it's like most other countries. We don't expect that Iran's foreign policy will be fundamentally changed by transferring power between administration and election. Okay. Maybe Mr. Trump was exceptional in some ways, but if you see United States, the whole national security agenda and foreign policy application, it's not many changes between the government coming and the next government coming, between Democrat or Republican. A second issue is that Iran's foreign policy decision-making is conducted by the Supreme National Security Council. This council is a very heavy hand for the supreme leader and has been intentionally designed to reflect diverse political views between Iranian politicians. This council includes politicians from across Iran political spectrum, so-called moderates, conservatives, principalists, and even sometimes reformists. So the council includes the head of three branches of government: parliament, judiciary, executive, and minister related to the national security issues like the foreign affairs minister, the military and intelligence organization, and also representative from the supreme leader. So this is another factor that they wanted to say. I believe we would not see many changes, sharp changes in Iran foreign policy. But on nuclear issues, as you mentioned, particular nuclear issues, we know that the new administration in Iran, Mr. Raisi, he will be inaugurated in early August. So in the next 40 days, we still have the Rouhani and Zarif as who led the negotiation with the United States. And just yesterday, the news came up from the last round of the negotiation in Vienna that all parties, especially the United States and Iran, they are in the final phases to restore the 2015 Iran nuclear deal named JCPOA. So I believe that before Raisi came to the office, comes to the office, this deal will be restored. And also, Raisi himself, during the campaign, during the public debate, he said, okay, I'm not against the nuclear deal. I'm not against the JCPOA. We just want to receive the benefits we expected from the deal in 2015. But we didn't receive anything. Trump comes and, came and withdrew from the deal and put all of the sanction against Iran again. So they said that, okay, the major issues that Iran needs is to sell freely its oil, petroleum, and natural resources, and also freely can transfer the currency into the government, into the country. They wanted to access to the international financial system. So if this happens and they get the guarantee that the United States never come out of the deal again, so they don't have any problem to restore the JCPOA, because at least for the limited time it can lift some of the sanction, and they can get some benefits for the economy, for the fragile economy Iran has.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Iran is, there's a lot to talk about, but I want to thank you, Mr. Azizi, for coming and spending some time with us. Back to you, Hena.
Thank you, Saleha. Crime is high this summer, so are the gun sales. Record gun sales and record crime rate. Is there a correlation? President Biden has announced a zero tolerance policy. Zero tolerance towards crime and towards gun, that's a tall order. Well, we have someone who studies these things, and she's a professor of law at the University of San Francisco, Professor Lara Bazelon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So why crimes are going up right now? Last weekend, Chicago had 50 gunshots.
I think it's probably because we're opening back up. And so we've been, obviously, as everybody knows, in a lockdown mode for over a year now, and people are going outside. Generally speaking, also, and this has nothing to do with COVID, crime rates tend to rise in the summer. I think that has something to do with how hot it gets and tempers flare. So this is actually somewhat statistically normal, but it may be exacerbated by the fact that crime rates were relatively depressed during the height of COVID.
But people are buying guns also at record level. Does it have something to do with more guns, more freedom? And, oh, I didn't commit some crime last year, so let me do it now.
I think that the gun problem in this country is completely out of control. And there are at this point more guns than people in the United States. Some people own multiple weapons. Some people own guns legally. Many people own guns illegally. And yes, the more guns there are in the culture, in society, the more violence you're going to have. The statistics show that, excuse me, guns are much, much more likely to be used not as self-defense, but actually, or for something like hunting, which is a sport, but in fact could accidentally go off or be used in an argument or a fight, quickly escalating it into something fatal. And so that's a real problem in this country. And there's multiple reasons for that, including our very permissive reading of the Second Amendment and the refusal really at the federal or most local and state levels to have real checks on gun control.
So President Biden has asked cities to use $350 billion, which was sanctioned through the relief program for the cities, to hire more police. Do you think more police means less crime?
This is a really complicated question. And as someone with deeply progressive values, I struggle with it because when I hear him say, there's this money that we've allocated states and local governments to help you fight COVID. And instead, what I'm telling you is you should go out and hire more police officers. As someone who doesn't necessarily equate a more robust police presence with less crime, but in fact, equates it often with outcomes like mass incarceration, that makes me very nervous. And I think the question really is, if you're going to hire more police officers, how are you going to be using them? And I think people on the left worry that when you hire more police officers and you train them in kind of a militarized way to police communities, what you're going to end up with is more of the kind of mass incarceration and systemic racism that people like me are deeply concerned about. If, on the other hand, what you're saying is these departments need more resources to, say, approach some of these things from more of a social services and mental health perspective, then I feel like that's a different thing. And I think when I was listening to Biden, he was trying to sort of placate both the more conservative leaning people who support him, but also the more progressive people by trying to say both things. And I guess the question is, how is that actually going to play out on the ground?
Professor Bazelon, before being a professor, you have been a public defender for 7 years in Los Angeles County. What is your reading? What type of policing will bring more safety?
Well, I can tell you what won't. I mean, one of the many cases that I defended when I was there and that the federal government brought all the time were these so-called felon in possession cases. So many of my clients were folks who had some kind of a prior felony conviction, and then they had been found in possession of a weapon. So that's essentially a status crime. They hadn't used it. They hadn't actually deployed it against anybody. And yet they were being brought into federal court and prosecuted for simply having it. And I guess for me, looking at those cases and why the federal government invested so much time and energy in them, I really question, was that keeping all of us more safe, when oftentimes my clients were people who, yes, they've made mistakes. They also lived in high crime, low income neighborhoods. And often this was about their own personal safety. So when I hear Biden kind of reference back the 90s and the early 2000s, which was when I was a lawyer in court with these cases, it makes me nervous because I don't think that was effective. I think there are other ways to prosecute. And what I like about his new plan is that he's targeting these ghost dealers. He's targeting people who are selling firearms who shouldn't be selling them. And I think when you move higher up the supply chain and you start looking at who is putting these guns into the stream of commerce and selling them to people who shouldn't have them in the first place, that seems like a more appropriate way to look at trying to stop this problem at a higher level. That said, I feel like it's a drop in the ocean because really our gun sale laws are so permissive that most of the people who are gun dealers who are selling to any type of person really are not actually going to be held liable under state or federal law.
So when President Biden says he will have zero tolerance policy towards the gun sellers, what does it actually means?
I suppose what he's saying is, look, gun sellers, if we catch you doing things you're not supposed to be doing, selling to someone who, say, has a felony conviction, selling to someone who has a documented mental illness, selling in violation of any kind of state or local law, we're going to prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law and try to send a deterrent message. That's what I hear him saying. And it's not necessarily that I have a problem with that. It's just going back to my earlier point. I'm not really sure how big an impact that's going to have, because I really feel like we're talking about, statistically speaking, relatively few people. Most gun sales are legal.
In 2020, about 300,000 people were refused through the background check system that you cannot own the gun. Do you think some of these people are going to go buy without the background check? Is it easy to purchase a gun without a proper process?
I think there are many, many people who are so determined to possess a gun for many, many different reasons that they will not be deterred by the law. And I do think, obviously, the zero tolerance policy is important in those cases, right? Because you don't want those people to be in possession of firearms that, for various, probably very good reasons, they're not supposed to have. So I think that part of the policy makes sense. But I also think that the problem of gun violence in the United States and the problem of gun sales and the problem of gun possession is so enormous and complicated and multifaceted in ways that you and I could talk about, that I just don't really think that this zero tolerance policy, while announced to great fanfare and sounds really aggressive, is going to actually make that much of a difference.
So you're a skeptic of it, but there may be other people who are a skeptic of his announcement, which seems to have not created much headlines either. So politically, probably it's not going to help. Is there any effort in the civil society, like a person like you who has been a public defender, knows what goes on there, and then you have become a researcher and a scholar and a professor in the field of law? So are there some people who have similar background? Can they come together and come up with a independent commission which recommends what will reduce the crime? Because a whole lot of people are concerned about crime. You know, in the democratic New York, where only a Democrat most likely has a chance of becoming a mayor, a former police officer is fighting to stop crime, and he is the front runner. So this seems to be something people are looking for. But can there be some life put into, based on research, based on experience of people like you?
So that's a really great question. And we're at such an interesting moment in our country right now, because, as you say, we just had this election in the mayor's race in New York, and the candidate who seems to be the candidate who's going to win is a man named Eric Adams, who was a former police officer and has said positive things in the past about very controversial policies like stop and frisk, which was held to be unconstitutional, and it stopped mainly Black and brown young men over 700,000 times to little effect. He's also said some things to sort of placate the left, but basically he's presented himself as somebody who can establish law and order. And interestingly, right now, that is the number one concern for New York voters. And so I think a lot of people like me looked at that election and looked at the DA election in New York that was happening at the same time for Manhattan DA, which is a very, very powerful position, and thought the progressive movement that's been reaching across all corners of the United States is going to have this moment in New York. And that's not what happened. It's not what happened at all. There were very progressive people running for district attorney, running for mayor in New York, who had platforms that were not explicitly about defunding the police, but certainly about reallocating resources around things like social services that you and I were talking about before, rather than this kind of traditional police presence. And those candidates lost. And I do think it's really interesting, because what we had before that were a number of people running and winning, at least in prosecutorial roles, across various cities: San Francisco, LA, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Boston, who were saying, we are running on a decarceration platform. We're running on a platform of letting more people out of prison. We're running on a platform of not prosecuting certain kinds of crimes. And already you're seeing this very strong pushback, because when crime rises, people get nervous and they see it as something that's a direct threat to themselves, even though most likely it's not. And even though the rise is somewhat incremental, and even though it's a much more complicated statistical analysis. And so then you see this pendulum swing back. And I feel like that's the moment that we're in. If you ask me, I do not think that returning to the policies of the 90s and the early 2000s is the way to go, because I think that we've seen from the research, the empirical data, that doesn't make us less safe, that doesn't cause crime to diminish, and also that it decimates communities, because essentially we're taking a whole segment of society and throwing them away because of the draconian punishments that Americans love to impose. If you ask me, I think we need to let this current progressive decarceration movement play out and see if this other method works, which is essentially to talk about what are the root causes of crime. And rather than attacking it on the back end, try and look at the front end, try to get people into Head Start when they're kids, try to focus on education, try to focus, certainly when they're young people getting in trouble in school, on alternatives like restorative justice rather than sending them to juvenile hall. Certainly thinking about how long does someone need to be in prison, even if they need to maybe be isolated for a certain amount of time. If you send a 19-year-old away, do you need to send them away for 60, 70, 80, 100 years? I mean, it just does away with the idea that people are capable of growth and change. And so to me, reverting backward, because we're in this moment where people feel, whether rationally or not, that there's some kind of rising crime peril, is the wrong way to go and reactionary.
But where will that conversation take place, where people can come to some sort of a consensus? I mean, in America, where people are left and right is not talking to each other, where domestic terrorism has become a top priority for the administration, for military, and for everyone. I hope they will not be having killer drones flying in our neighborhood. But is there a way for people to talk in the civil society who are more concerned about the safety and who are more concerned about the smarter way of keeping everyone safe, including those who we lock them away?
Well, I feel like we need to have much more of a national conversation that is a civil conversation, because I think the other thing, unfortunately, that's happened in this country is that it's incredibly polarized. And rather than thinking about these issues from a rational and humane and results-oriented perspective, people look at them from a political perspective. So you're either on the red team or you're on the blue team when it comes, for example, to any sort of criminal justice reform. And so it's very hard in this space, I think, to listen to the best arguments rather than to just sit in your own camp where you can feel safe and not have your ideas questioned. One thing that I think is happening, at least in my city and other cities as well, that I find very interesting is that the local officials, our DA, for example, makes himself very available to the public, has regular public meetings where people can participate. During the pandemic by Facebook, I imagine now they'll be in person. And basically he just takes questions from the community. And I saw that happen a bit too in Philadelphia. There's a really interesting documentary called Philly DA that I recommend to your viewers that charts the first year and a half of this reformed DA's career in Philadelphia. And you see him going to these meetings and hearing from his constituents, but also really interacting with all of the various players in the city. And I think the more discussion we have, the more open forum debates we have, the more these public officials avail themselves of the citizenry, and also, maybe even academics who have some practical experience and wisdom to share, the better off we all are. It's just really a question of getting people to engage in that conversation in a way that they're coming to the table in good faith, rather than, I think, pushing their own agenda to the exclusion of being able to listen to anybody else's idea.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Lara Bazelon, Professor of Law at the University of San Francisco. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Back to you, Saleh.
Thank you so much for watching Best of Muslim News. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.